Okay, so I think that we can go ahead and get started. And so today we're going to be talking about CNN architectures, and this is going to form the basis for everything that we do in the class related to image data. So image classification, object detection, document layout analysis, image captioning, etc. And so we already talked a little bit at the end of last class about convolutions and how, it's essential that we incorporate spatial structure into our networks if we want to think about, spatial questions, which image detection is. And so this is just a picture we talked about last class about what convolutions are doing. And hopefully you guys had a chance to watch the lecture I sent you from the Julia lab at MIT, where it gave some more visual intuition with animations of what convolutions are doing. And so just to kind of recap what we talked about last time and what the video I sent touched on. So we can think of like convolutions as filters, and we're passing these filters over the image. And the filters are going to help us to extract features that in turn are going to be useful for our downstream tasks, which could be classifying the image, it could be localizing or detecting objects, it could be image segmentation, where we figure out what pixels belong to which objects, image captioning, whatever the downstream task is. Essentially, you can think of the weights in these filters as extracting features from the images that are going to help us to be successful at that task. And so filters can have different sizes. It could be 3 pixels by 3 pixels, 5 by 5, and 7 by 7 are the most common. They can have different strides, and by that I mean how many pixels you move it over each time. And so if you have, a larger stride, say you have a stride of 2, that's going to effectively downsample the image, right? Because you're moving it over more than 1 pixel as you take this moving average. And you might zero pad the image just to maintain the size if that's important for your architecture. Importantly, filters always extend through the full depth of the input. So say you have a 25 by 25 pixel color image, that's going to be an input depth of 25 by 25 by 3, right? The depth is each of the 3 color channels in that image. And if you apply a single 5 by 5 filter, implicitly it's a 5 by 5 by 3 filter because the filter has to span the depth. Suppose that has stride 1 and you're going to zero pad the edges. Your output layer will be 25 by 25 by 1. In other words, you're essentially, taking the dot product across this depth, and that's important. So when you apply filters, it will collapse the depth of the image. In practice, you never apply just one filter. So suppose you have the same 25 by 25 color image, and you're applying 92 3 by 3 by 3 filters with a stride of 1, that's going to give you a 25 by 25 by 92 output layer. And so each of those output layers corresponds to what you get by applying one of the filters, where again, you're just essentially, taking the dot product and adding up. And so as you saw in the video that I sent, like different filters will extract different sorts of features. And so, before deep learning, people hand engineered these filters. And, if it was just, say a Gaussian filter, you use that to just put more weight on whatever's in the center. You could have a variety of other pixels to extract, variety of other filters to extract like edges, sharpness, contrast, etc. And so when deep learning comes in, you're using the training examples to estimate these filters rather than hand engineering them. And hand engineering is just very brittle. The other thing you're going to need to know before we kind of talk more about architectures is what the term pooling means. So by pooling, we just mean downsampling images and preserving the depth. So you all are very familiar with this, anytime you upload an image to the internet or whatever, it's probably going to be downsampled, right? And that's just what pooling means. And so the most common approach that we'll see is max pooling, which simply takes the max pixel value within a given filter as it's moved across the image. And so here's an example here, and you see, that we have a 2x2, we're max pooling with a 2x2 filter. And so it's just within each of those color squares, it's just taking the maximum pixel value. And kind of the reason why you want to do this is that when you downsample, you want to preserve the most prominent thing kind of in that region. And so this is generally how downsampling is done. Pooling preserves the depth usually. We'll talk about a different kind of pooling later that collapses the depth. But for now, when we say pooling, it's preserving the depth of the image. So another, the depth of the input, but it is downsampling, and pooling is going to be, we'll see it come up. Okay, and so just to make sure we understand this, I just want to highlight the difference between convolution and pooling. So they both can be used to downsample, but they do so in different ways. So convolution involves parameters, and you estimate those through back propagation. Whereas pooling doesn't have any parameters that you're estimating at all. You're just taking, if it's max pooling, you're just taking the max pixel value within the filter. And so you don't have these parameters that are combining different pixels together. You just take the max. It's just like a rule. Multiple convolutional filters are typically applied to an input layer to extract different types of features, as we were just talking about. And they could downsample in the process if they have a stride, of greater than 1. Or they don't pad the edges, whereas max pooling can be thought of just as a single, it's just a single filter that's extracting the max value. And then finally, convolutions are applied over the depth of the image. So if you have like a convolutional filter, that's going to take that depth and collapse it. So for example, let's say you have a single filter, it's an 11 by 11. By 3, and you're applying it to a 227 pixel, 227 by 227 pixel image, and you have a stride 4. And so each time you move the filter over 4 pixels, that's going to yield an output layer that's 55 by 55 by 1, and it's 1 because that's what convolution does. It combines the depth of your input just using the dot product. Whereas max pooling, if you have the same size filter and stride, you're going to get a 55 by 55 by 3 output because you're just downsampling. You're not combining the depth of that input. So I want to have a brief note about benchmark data sets because this is super important in kind of computer science generally, and it's very different than in economics. It's sort of a very different exercise in that these benchmark data sets essentially define a task that we'd like to do a good job on, and we know what the ground truth is, and then kind of you train models and see how good you can get, and much of the field has been built around that. And so the 3 main ones that you'll see come up in the context of CNNs are, first of all, there's one called CIFAR 10, which is the oldest and smallest one, and it has 60,000 images. Those images belong to 10 classes. They're like car, horse, dog, airplane, 10 generic classes, and there's 6,000 images per class. And this was used especially in the days before kind of very deep networks. So when you didn't need such large data sets, you'll see it come up a lot. The second one is ImageNet. That has 14 million images. Over 1 million of those images have object bounding boxes. The rest just have an object class. And this is the main data set for the advancement of this literature through sort of the mid 2010s. And the architectures that we're going to see today, which are the ones that have dominated the field, are all ImageNet winners. And so every year ImageNet has a contest with different benchmarks, and you see who does the best. Another data set that's kind of even more modern is COCO. And so that's object detection, segmentation, and captioning. And so here I need to say the difference between detection and segmentation, which I don't think we've talked about yet. So object detection is you find a box, kind of the tightest box around an object in an image, and its class. And so it could be like horse, and then you'd have a box around the horse. Whereas segmentation is to find precisely those pixels that belong to the horse, right? And so you can see the entire outline of the horse. And obviously segmentation is a bit more of a challenging task. It's also kind of less relevant by and large, I think, to a lot of what we do. Because if you're trying to recognize structures in a document, they're probably just going to be a box. Usually they're not going to be some weird shape, and it's going to be dramatically less costly to have annotators draw boxes than to label every single pixel in your image, right? And so kind of by and large, we'll be focused on detection, but segmentation is another thing people talk about a lot. And then COCO also has image captioning, which means you show the computer an image and it generates a sentence. And it's also a central benchmark that you'll see come up a lot, and you should know kind of what that is. And so these benchmarks have annual challenges associated with them. And as I said, the architectures we'll see in this lecture were all developed for ImageNet challenges between 2012 and 2016. And these challenges have different contest categories. So for image classification, there's top 1 and top 5. And so top 1 just means you got the class right, whereas top 5 means that the correct class is within the top 5 probabilities that your model predicted. The most 5 probable classes, the true classes amongst those. ImageNet also has localization, which is just, it's like object detection, except you only find one object in an image. And this is just sort of for historical reasons. Like before we had good models for object detection, first of all, you had to be able to locate a single object in an image, but we won't really talk much about localization because it's completely inapplicable to documents. So some people argue that data sets like ImageNet are even more important to the advancement of deep learning than the model architectures, because essentially, and there's lots of anecdotes that people were motivated to develop these architectures because they wanted to win the ImageNet contest. The ImageNet challenge ended in 2017 because it was solved, essentially. The models were getting better than human accuracy. And so if you kept on trying to improve, you would just be trying to predict the things that the humans got wrong in creating this labeled data. So essentially it was solved, and and then the challenge ended, but there's still COCO challenge now, which focuses more on things like segmentation and captioning that are still a little bit more active areas. Okay, does that all sort of make sense on the data sets? Okay. So before we talk about using neural networks to classify images, I just want to briefly talk about image classification with a linear classifier. Which isn't something you'd ever do, but I think that it kind of helps to give a little bit better of an intuition for part of why we need a neural network in the first place. Like why isn't kind of a linear classifier good enough? And so a classifier is just a function that combines the inputs and the weights to produce a vector with the class probabilities. And a linear classifier just takes the form that the f of wx, which is your probabilities, like it's 90% class 1, 2% class 2, so on to 1% class 10, that vector is just the weights times the inputs. So to give an intuition for this, suppose that we have a color image, it's 32 by 32, and we want to classify which of the 10 classes each of the images belongs to. So this could be, this is, taken straight from the CIFAR 10 data set I mentioned, right? Where this was kind of the task that the literature was focused on for a time. And so if we think about the dimensions of this, right, the output, f of wx, is just a 10 by 1 vector. It's a probability for each of those 10 classes. And if we just restack the input x, 32 times 32 times 3 is 3072. And so hence, in order for the matrix multiplication, right, to work out, so that W times X equals F of WX, W must be 10 by 3072. And this implies that we can think of each of the, if you think about the linear algebra behind this, we can think of that 10 by 3072 weight matrix as consisting of a single template for each of the 10 classes. So essentially what happens with the linear classifier is each image will be compared pixel by pixel to each of the templates to assess the class probabilities. There's no convolutions in this simple model yet, right? We're just seeing what like a simple linear classifier would do. So you see that here. So for the sake of simplicity, let's suppose that we had an image that had only 4 pixels in it, and that there's just 3 classes. It can be a cat, a dog, or a ship. And so our weight matrix, is going to have the dimensions that you see here, and we can think of each row of that weight matrix as being the template for that object. And so the orange color is the template for cat, and the purple color is for car. And then you just multiply those, and remember the highest value is the class that we're going to choose. And so this is like what a linear classifier is doing. And I think to make it clear, this is a cool example that's showing if you were to train a linear classifier on CIFAR 10, right, which is the data set that has like 10 different classes in it. And as we just saw, you're only allowed to learn one template for each category, because essentially you're just applying the template for each category with the image and taking the highest score. What does it look like? Well, here is a visualization of what you would get out if you trained a linear classifier on CIFAR 10. And you can see there, like kind of the car, you can generally see the outline of a car in the center. You see with the things in nature, the deer is surrounded by like a lot of green. And remember, these are going to be the size of the image, like 32 by 32 or 64 by 64. And then these are 3-channel filters, right? Because the color is the 3 channels of the depth. But if you go and you look at the horse on the far right there, you kind of see why inherently having a single filter is going to be problematic, because you can see that that horse has, you can kind of make out that it has 2 heads. And why is that? Well, most pictures of the horse either show the horse looking to the left or the horse looking to the right, but you only have like 1 filter. And so this 1 filter is just kind of doing like the best that it can, to pick up the horse. But that's kind of inherently going to limit your accuracy. So this suggests that, a world with more filters is going to be better, and we're going to have many filters when we move into CNNs. So are there any thoughts or questions about linear classification? You'll often put a linear classifier at the end of like a neural network, and that's kind of fine. But if that's all you have, you guys you saw what happened. Okay, so just to give an overview of what we want to talk about, as I said, if this literature sort of revolves around the ImageNet annual challenge. And so ImageNet was this data set put together by a professor in computer science who's Fai Li, who's now at Stanford. And she essentially had like people on Amazon Turk just label a whole bunch of images and then started a contest with it. And it started in the contest itself started in 2010. I think the paper for the data set was published in 2009 and is actually kind of one of the most cited papers in deep learning. So the first 2 years, people just tried to solve this challenge using features engineering, which means like they hand designed kind of the templates to try to extract useful features. And you can see it doesn't do great. So this is top 5 accuracy. The classification error with top 5 accuracy. And so around 26 to 28% of the time, the hand engineered features couldn't pick out, the true category was not in the top 5 classes they predicted. And, so for kind of most intents and purposes, this is probably useless because it's getting it pretty wrong most of the time. Then in 2012, you have your first CNN. And this in some sense was really the paper that like kickstarted the whole deep learning kind of revolution. 2013, it does a little better, but that's really by kind of tweaking some of the hyperparameters on 2012. And then, you kind of keep improving. And as I said, by like 2017, they just end the challenge because it's already like better than humans. And so this is just to show you a little bit of a comparison of the winners. So in 2010 and 2011, they're not even using like deep networks. 2012, the first CNN, it has 8 layers. And as I said, 2013 was just essentially some tweaks on the 2012 winner. And 2014, you see further improvements. And so your error rate is now down to 7% from kind of the first neural network, which was a 16% error. And that has 19 or 22 layers. Those two were virtually tied, and we're going to look at both of them. And then you go forward to 2015, which was, for all intents and purposes, kind of what essentially solved the challenge, and it goes up to 152 layers. And so there's just this dramatic increase in depth, and we'll talk about why that's useful and how they managed to do that. And then, we haven't talked about these architectures yet. We'll come back to this figure at the end of the lecture, so I know the labels don't quite make sense. But just to say, this is showing the number of operations required, the top one accuracy, and that round circle is the memory. And so essentially what happens is AlexNet is the first one in 2012, the orange one there. And you see that they're able to get the top one accuracy way up. And so, and the top 5 accuracy is essentially, close to 100%. And they're able to do that, it has more operations, but it's not going to require dramatically more sort of memory usage. Okay, so that's sort of an overview. And now we're going to talk about 5 of these architectures, which all performed, very well in this contest, in which I think, when it comes down to what you're going to use today, you're going to use one of the last 2. You're going to either use ResNet or ResNext. The first 3, are kind of more to give you an intuition for, the innovations that made this all possible. And I think in some sense, it's like a really, just a really fascinating and beautiful thing to learn about, because in some sense the architectures are just very simple, and the ideas behind them, once you see them, it's the kind of thing where you think oh, that makes a ton of sense, but obviously it wasn't obvious ex ante at the time. And so I think from a scientific standpoint, it's a really amazing literature. Okay. And so the first architecture we're going to talk about is AlexNet, which is named for the lead author on this paper, who was Alex Krzyzewski, who was essentially, he was a grad student of Jeff Hinton's at Toronto, and basically had heard about this ImageNet competition and kind of also had some insights into the fact that GPUs could be used to parallelize these computations. And convinced Jeff Hinton, who was his advisor, he and another grad student, to enter this competition. They essentially wrote this paper that kind of set off a deep learning revolution, and I think is one of the, if not the most cited paper in deep learning. Probably more cited than anything in economics already. So It was the first CNN-based paper to enter the ImageNet competition, to win the ImageNet competition, and it just dramatically lowered the top 5 error rate from 26% to around 15%, which is just, it's a huge improvement in performance. And okay, so what does this do? And so essentially, it's an 8-layer network. So remember the depth of the network is the number of layers with trainable weights. And so you see here what the 8 layers of this are. And so then the first layer, you have a convolutional layer, and then you do max pooling. Remember that doesn't have any parameters, right? So that doesn't count as like a separate layer. And they do a normalization thing that people don't really do anymore, and it's not necessary. So we're not gonna really talk about that. And then they apply another convolutional layer, another max pool, another normalization, then 3 more convolutional layers and max pool at the end of that. And then they have these 3 kind of fully connected layers at the end of the network. And in the diagram in the paper, which you'll often see, you see that it's like split in 2. And so why did they do that? The reason is that at this time, GPUs had 3 gigs of memory. Like, you know, today, kind of like say that the kind of state of the art consumer GPU card has 24 gigs. And so it just wasn't very powerful. And so they had to split this model over 2 GPUs, which, you know, in itself was an exciting kind of advancement. And so that's just why this diagram is split in 2. And to give you kind of a better sense for what each of these layers are. And so the ImageNet challenge, you start with these 227 by 227 color images, and then they apply a convolutional layer. The filters are 11 by 11, a stride of 4. That gets you down on, they apply 96 of those. And so now, you know, they've effectively downsampled by having this stride of 4. And the fact that there's 96 of these filters means that you have now 96, a depth of 96. And then they pool that to downsample it more. And then they do this normalization. And now they're going to apply 256 5 by 5 filters with a stride of 1. And then they're going to pool that, normalize it, and then they're going to apply 384 filters, and another time applying 384, and then apply 256. And you might be asking, well, why are they applying more filters as you get further into the network? And the reason is just they're trying to keep the memory usage fairly constant. So remember, they're downsampling the size of the images as they go along. And so for the same memory, they can have more depth, right? More filters. And the goal is to kind of, you know, to max out the memory that they had available at that time and keep it fairly constant. And then they're going to have these 3, or they're going to pool again. So now they're down to kind of 6 by 6 inputs, and then they're going to have 3 fully connected layers. And so you might be asking, like, well, why did they choose these filter sizes? And we're just, I think essentially this is what they found that worked. You know, they kind of spent a year on this and this worked the best. We're going to see later that there's been kind of a move towards just using 3 by 3 filters. But, you know, for this particular network, starting out with this 11 by 11 filter and kind of using it to also downsize worked well. So AlexNet was an early adopter of ReLU. Remember, that's just this rectified linear unit function that just, if the value is less than 0, it turns it to 0, and otherwise it's the value. It kind of, we saw it in the video last class, it has this shape, and it introduces nonlinearity in a way that's like very straightforward to train, you know, compared to say the sigmoid function that we saw last time. So it's like you can train this thing like, you know, 8 times faster using ReLU. They also made heavy use of data augmentation for training. And so what that means is just like you can like jitter the image or skew the image or shift the colors over And that's something that you'll see a lot too. It's essentially a way of getting labels for free, right? Because you already have the, like, say you have, an ImageNet, you have 1 million labeled images, but you can apply these kind of transformations, rotate them, do all kinds of things, and you can get up to having like 6 million labels. And obviously they're correlated, so it's not like having, 6 million independent images labeled, but that kind of also helped them out. It was one of the first papers to leverage GPUs, which allowed it to train a much deeper neural network than it would have been possible on a CPU. And I should say it's built upon a lot of ideas that were actually kind of already out there in the 1990s. And some people say that this paper, LayNet paper, should be the one that gets credited kind of with starting deep learning. But I think, like in the 1990s, people just didn't have like GPUs, and so they just couldn't do much cross validation, or it was just they couldn't do nearly as much. And I should say that the guy that came up with LayNet is also considered one of the fathers of AI. So it's not like he doesn't get cited and now he's like homeless or something. So we won't feel too sorry for him. But that's just kind of a historical note that that it does build upon some of the ideas that were had been out there, but weren't really implemented at scale. Okay, are there any questions about AlexNet? Okay, so AlexNet was the winner in 2012. In 2013, the winner just effectively made some hyperparameter tweaks to AlexNet. It's the same architecture, so we won't really talk about that. But then in 2014, there were 2 models, and they were very close to each other in terms of their performance, and they both incorporate important ideas. And so we'll talk about those 2, which are called VGG and GoogleNet. Okay. So the key idea behind VGG, which was developed by a group, I believe at Oxford, is that you want to have a deeper network with smaller filters. And so you remember, like, AlexNet started out with, I think, an 11 by 11 convolution, whereas VGG is just going to have 3 by 3 comms with periodic 2 by 2 max pooling throughout the depth of the network. And so you might ask yourself, well, why is this true? Why would you prefer to have smaller filters and a deeper network? And I think the insight here is that if you use smaller filters and deeper networks, you can have the same effective receptive field. And so suppose that you have a network and you're using 3 by 3 filters throughout with a stride of 1. And so in the first layer, the receptive field of that filter is 3, right? Just it's a 3 by 3 filter. Like trivially, it's taking in, its field of vision is 3 by 3, right? And so that's obvious to see. But now suppose you apply that same 3 by 3 filter to the second layer, kind of to the output from the previous conv. Well, then the effective receptive field, on the original image is 5 by 5, right? Because each kind of pixel of those 3 by 3 pixels that you're running the filter over is already combining kind of multiple information from the previous layer. And then if you apply it to the next layer up, it has a receptive field on the original image of 7 by 7, etc. And so that 3 by 3 filter applied to 3 layers has the same receptive field as the 7 by 7 that you just applied to the original input. So you might ask yourself, well, then this still doesn't show why the 3 by 3 with 3 layers is better than the 7 by 7 with 1 layer. And the reason for that is more nonlinearity because you're applying ReLU after each of these filters. So this goes back to the question before, how do these models do so well? well, they're applying, you know, non-linearities over and over again, and that allows you to kind of fit things very flexibly. And then the other thing that's actually maybe even more important is that if you work out the math of how many parameters this is, it's 3 by 3 over 3 layers is fewer parameters than 7 by 7 over 1 layer. So it's computationally more efficient, and pretty much with these deep nets, they're kind of like the ones that win are going to always be pushing like the boundary of sort of what's computationally feasible. And so that computational efficiency is important. And so this is what the architecture looks like. Sorry, I know that there's a bunch of numbers here, but as you see, like essentially it's going to be applying like they're, as I said, they're all Conv3 layers and they're all pool 2. And then the question is just like how many filters, right? So it starts with 64, then 128, 256, and 512. And again, the reason why you apply more and more like filters as you get deeper into the network is because you're downsampling the images, and so you have more memory on your machine that you can be using. If you add this all up, it's, I don't know, it's really a lot of parameters. You see that like that fully connected layer, like towards the bottom, it has 102 million, like 760,000 plus parameters. So, you know, that alone is just like the fully connected layers just dominate, you know, in terms of the number of parameters that are required. But I think overall, this is something like maybe 135 million parameters. This is VGG 16. There's also a VGG 19, but it's even bigger and it doesn't really do much better. Yeah, so that's VGG 16. Are there any questions about this? Okay. And so we're going to talk about now the second model that did really well at ImageNet in 2014, which is called GoogleNet, or also oftentimes called Inception. And it does very similar, but in a different way, which is going to be important for kind of the literature moving forward. And so first of all, it gets rid of the fully connected layers, and that's going to save a lot of parameters, because you guys just saw those, you know, in a single fully connected layer, it was like 102 million parameters in VGG. And then the other key feature is what they call the inception model, which is why this is oftentimes also referred to as inception, which is a local network topology that's at each layer. And so the idea here is to apply several different features operations in parallel and then concatenate them together. And so this kind of goes back to the idea that, okay, so we have these increasingly deep neural networks, right? You know, how many passes through do we need? How many kind of layers of weights does the information get passed through? But in addition to the depth of the network, there's also the width of the network, right? So, you know, how many parameters are you estimating kind of at each pass? And, you know, in principle, like you should be able to improve performance, not just by increasing the depth, you know, increasing how many layers that you pass through, but also by increasing the width of each of those layers. And so the problem with this is that if you were to just do it naively, you would totally blow up the number of parameters, and you would run out of memory like very, very quickly. And so this is kind of a naive inception model here that does something similar to what inception does, but in sort of a naive way. So let's suppose that you have an input to this layer that's like 28 by 28 by 256, right? So you're somewhere kind of in the middle of your network. And the idea of inception is that you're going to kind of side by side in parallel apply different convolutions as well as pooling. And so you're going to apply a 1 by 1, 128 1 by 1s, 192 3x3s, 96 5x5s, and you're going to also do a 3x3 pool. And then you're just going to concatenate those all together. And so you see they're all 28 by 28, right? Which you need in order to be able to concatenate it. And when you put all those together, that's 28 by 28 by 672. And so this, single layer alone has 854 million convops, like just with the conv filters, and that's not even counting for the pooling. And the problem with the pooling, it's going to make this problem even worse when you go to the next layer, because pooling preserves the depth. And so with adding on the pooling, the depth can only grow. I'm not talking about the depth of the network here, which is important. There's two different ways that we talk about depth, right? There's the depth of the network, how many layers it has, and then there's the depth of the input, right? Which in this case is 28 by 28 by 672. And if you string a multiple of these inception modules together, it's going to keep on getting that 672 is going to keep on blowing up. It's going to keep on getting more and more depth. And that means this inception module takes 854 million convops, but now because you have, instead of a 256, you have a 672, it's going to be in the, in the billions and billions of convops the next layer. And so that's just infeasible, right? You just couldn't do that. So why this seems like, oh, this is a promising concept, because I don't just have depth, I also have the width of this. It's not gonna work, even if you're Google who developed this model and you have essentially infinite compute. It's not really infinite when you get into models like this. And so the key insight of GoogleNet is that you can have these bottleneck layers that project features maps to lower dimensions using a 1x1 convolution. And so what a 1x1 convolution does is it preserves the spatial dimension. And so that just means, you have this, your filter is literally like kind of, if you have a 64, your input is of 64 depth and your filter is 1x1 by 64. And so you're not spatially kind of putting information together, but you're just essentially taking a dot product with the filter across the depth. And so you can preserve your spatial dimension while reducing depth by taking a dot product at each spatial location. So it's essentially just a way to take a linear combination of your input feature maps, right? And so and on the left, you have 56 by 56, which is like your resolution. And then you have the 64 depth. And each of those you can think of as a features map from applying 64 filters in the previous layer of the network. And then what you can do is collapse that down. And you can do that by estimating like 32 different filters. It could be 5 different filters, however many, whatever number you want in principle could be there. But essentially you're taking this linear combination with these filters and using your 1x1 convolution. And so you're not concerned about kind of pooling information from different spatial locations, but you're just getting rid of some of that depth in order to make things computationally feasible. And this obviously relates closely to the previous question about well, why don't we want to preserve the depth with convolution, which is kind of exactly the intuition in this, that you're gonna blow up the network and run out of memory really quickly before you can have kind of depth at all, if you were preserving the depth of your inputs. In other words, you were applying all these filters. You need to take a linear combination of them, with parameters that are themselves going to be estimated as part of the network, or you're gonna blow things up. And so this is what the inception module did to make this feasible. So it's the same as we saw before. There's a 1x1, a 3x3, a 5x5 conv layers, and 3x3 max pooling in each kind of inception unit. But now, before you apply the 3x3 and the 5x5 convolutions, you apply 1x1 convolutions to decrease the depth And you also apply that same 1-by-1 convolution to decrease the depth after your max pooling. And so this reduces the conv operations from 854 previously to 358. And it also reduces the output depth from 672 to 480. And it reduces the output depth by doing the 1-by-1 convolution after the max pooling. And so you're, because max pooling preserves the depth. And so if you didn't have this 1-by-1 convolution after the max pooling, the size of your depth is going to blow up when you stack multiple inception units on top of each other. So you need this 1-by-1 convolution layer to take this linear combination and get rid of some of that depth, so you don't run out of memory. And so that's what kind of, when you put it after pooling, it's helping you to keep the depth of your output manageable. And when you have it before the convolutional layers, it's just reducing the number of convops, like just reducing the number of convolutions that you have to compute. And this is gonna, it can be engineered to get this thing down into a range where, with current technology, it can actually be estimated. And so, again, relating to what we talked about before, you do lose information, obviously, by taking a linear combination. But remember, you're applying like all these different filters, and there's obviously like some redundancy in the filters. And so, the parameters of the filters, that's what you're kind of estimating when you estimate your network, and you're applying them all to the same input. And so it's not as if they are independent information, right? Like, they're trying to pull out different things, but you have a lot of them, and there could be like a fair amount of redundancy in them. So you're not necessarily like throwing away as much information as you might kind of like naively think when you apply these 1-by-1 convolutions. And then the additional benefit of this, that may actually help is that after you apply the 1-by-1 convolutions, again, you always, like after the convolution, you always apply ReLU. And so you're actually getting more nonlinearity, and it's possible at least that might actually kind of help you. And so that's the intuition for why you can do this, and it's actually like, not a bad thing. Okay. The other important thing is it gets rid of the fully connected layers. Suppose at the second to last layer you had 7 by 7, 1024 7 by 7 features maps. And so essentially you've applied 1024 filters and you have all these features maps. And what you want to do after you've run all your convolutions is to have a 1 by 1024 vector that tells you the probability that your image belongs to each of these like 1024 classes. And so if you want to get that with a fully connected layer, that's 51.3 million weights, right? Which is why we saw in VGG that the fully connected layers were just massive. And so GoogleNet just gets rid of that. And what it does instead is just to apply what it's called global average pooling. And so in the same example, after you've applied all your conv layers, you have around 1,000 like 7 by 7 features maps. It just collapses each of those 1,000 7 by 7 features maps into a 1-by-1 by averaging. Then you have your you have your vector, and you could like apply softmax or something on top of that, which we'll talk about next class to get your probabilities. So by doing this, you get rid of like 51.3 million parameters, which is, would take like a huge amount of memory to estimate. So this is just like, in terms of saving you parameters, like this is huge. And you might think like, well, like, this has to lead to some kind of deterioration of performance because you just got rid of like 51 million parameters. But the authors actually argue this is good because it reduces overfitting. And they show that if they were to have a fully connected layer, instead of just doing this this average pooling, global average pooling at the end of the network, that their top one accuracy would actually fall, like not dramatically, but it would fall a little bit. And they say that's because of overfitting, right? And so I think like this paper kind of changed the way people think, because before that we thought that we needed this fully connected layer at the end. And instead, if you're doing pretty well previously, you can just have this, just simple averaging and get rid of a ton of parameters. And that's obviously going to free up memory for you to have like a deeper network. And so GoogleNet is 22 layers compared to 16, right, for VGG. And so by getting rid of the fully connected layers, they could actually have like a deeper network. And so this is what the full architecture is. As I said, it's 22 layers. And so remember, like each of the layers is essentially a layer with trainable weights. And so you see the inception modules as you go along in this, and you see kind of how there are two layers, right? Because first of all, you need those one by one conv layers to reduce the size, and then you apply the 1 by 1, 3 by 3, 5 by 5 next to each other, and you're also doing pooling at each layer. And so essentially all this is doing is taking this and stacking a bunch of these, essentially. And at the beginning, it includes some just standard vanilla convolutional and pool layers. And another thing to note, which we're gonna talk more about this in a minute, is that you see kind of on the bottom here, there's these two like auxiliary layers coming out. And those essentially have an average pool, a 1 by 1 convolution, fully connected softmax. And so the softmax, which I said we're gonna talk about more next class, is producing image classification probabilities like in the middle of the network. This is used for training. It's not used for testing or inference. It's not used to estimate how well it's doing, but when you're training, you care about how well you're doing in the middle of the network. And the intuition for that is that, this is a really deep network. And so the middle layers should do reasonably well at classification as well. And you really need to you cannot have, like if you had this without those layers, you would have a problem that's called a vanishing gradient, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, and in the context of the next paper, ResNet, which is the one that actually really more elegantly solves the vanishing gradient problem. And so you might ask, well, why did they have this specific architecture? So a lot of it comes back to there's the very real intuitions that we talked about, the idea that you combine these networks within a network and you can stack them. The idea of 1 by 1 convolutions was super important, getting rid of the fully connected layers and having those auxiliary layers to deal with vanishing gradient. But in terms of the very precise architecture, it's just that, this paper was written by people at Google who had massive compute. And it's kind of not an accident that they did this, and it wasn't just like academics purely like at a university who did this, because they could do just so much cross-validation, and having this many particular layers and this particular configuration like worked best. So there's like general principles that come out of it, but it's also just like, it was Google and they could test a lot of different things to get precisely, and there's an intuition for why the things in the first bullet point are important, but not an intuition for like why it's precisely, this sort of architecture. Okay. Are there any questions about that? Okay, so now I'm going to talk about ResNet, which is also kind of very similar to ResNext in the final 10 minutes. And this is now the state of the art. Like if you're going to go and do image classification or object detection, especially, you'll probably use ResNet or ResNext, but it kind of builds upon all these previous innovations. So ResNet has up to 152 layers. And so it just like, remember like when GoogleNet came out, it had 22 layers, and that kind of blew people away. And then this just totally like totally exceeds that. And dramatically reduce the top 5 layers. So it gets down to 3.57%, which is like better than humans. And ImageNet, it won all the ImageNet contests. It won the COCO contests, which are like detection and segmentation. So it just essentially just beat everything else by a wide margin. And so what was its insight? How did it get, why didn't people get so deep before? In like a normal CNN, by that I mean things, you know, like we saw with like AlexNet or GoogleNet, can you just keep adding more and more layers to improve accuracy? And the answer is no. And so you might think the reason you can't do that is overtraining, but that's actually not correct. There's ways to deal with overtraining, but the reason you can't do this in a standard kind of a CNN is that you're not going to be able to optimize the network. It's going to be an optimization problem. And you can see that from these two graphs that come from the ResNet paper. And so they compare just kind of a standard CNN architecture with 20 layers versus 56 layers. And the testing errors on the y-axis, iterations on the x-axis. And you can see that the 20 layer one does much better than the 56 layer one, but not just in the test data, but also in the training data, right? And you're not worried about like overfitting in your training data. So this is a clear indication that something has gone wrong with the optimization. And if you just think about it kind of intuitively, if you didn't have a problem with optimization or with overfitting, your deep nets should be able to do at least as well as shallower nets, because you could just take the layers that you learned out of your shallower model and just set the additional layers to the identity mapping. And that's going to be the same, right? So it should be at least as good, right? If you were able to optimize the thing correctly, it shouldn't make you worse to have like a deeper, you know, network. And especially on your training data, where then overfitting like isn't an issue. Overfitting comes in when you test it on new data. And so the optimization problem, which was well known, is called vanishing gradients. And so remember from last lecture about how back propagation is just essentially the chain rule. And so if you get a deeper and deeper network, you now have like 152 layers, you're applying the chain rule through this entire like very deep network. And so you're repeatedly multiplying by numbers that can ultimately make the gradient very small. And so if the gradient is very small, your learning is going to be very, very slow. And in the extreme, if the gradient goes to 0, then you can't update the parameters at all. And this is kind of like a well-known problem. And that's what this paper kind of gets around. And as a result, like residual networks, which is how it gets around that, have become kind of dominant. And so in GoogleNet, they had those auxiliary loss layers in the middle, and they were trying to use that kind of to get around, but it wouldn't scale to kind of things that were larger than GoogleNet. And so the inside of this paper, which I think is just really beautiful, because it's like very kind of simple, but it wasn't obvious to people at the time, is that in a traditional network, you know, we have some h of x function, right? And we have some input x, and we're choosing the weights to minimize that h of x function, right? Which is exactly kind of the intuition that we saw in the videos from last class. And so what this paper does is say, well, instead of trying to choose the weights to fit h of x, let's try to choose the weights to fit the residual. So just like h of x minus x. And then we can construct the output to be just f of x plus x. And so you see that in this graph here. You start with x, and you have a convolution, and you're trying to fit f of x. And then you have another convolution, and you pass that through ReLU, and then you have another convolution, then the output of that, you add x back on. And so instead of trying to minimize, you know, h of x, you're minimizing the residual of that, h of x minus x. If you choose the weights of 0, h of x is just going to be x, right? And so you will do at least as well as the shallower net by just choosing the weights of 0. And you see here at the bottom kind of the function for f of x. And so like, what's the intuition for kind of why this is better? Essentially, residual mappings just make it easier to learn the identity mapping, right? Like this, so that intuition we talked about before, that you should be able to do at least as well if you're already in a good place and then you just apply the identity mapping for the rest of the layers. And it's easier to estimate that with residual mappings. And it helps address the vanishing gradient problem, which, you know, what happens if we were to back propagate through the identity function? We're just multiplying the gradient by 1, right? There's also an intuition. If you have a 152 depth network, you just need like kind of little tweaks to your X each time. And it's easier to kind of optimize those little tweaks by optimizing the residual. And so residual blocks have become kind of the elementary building block for almost all CNNs today. This is just essentially how CNNs work now, and it effectively just it makes the network easier to optimize. It helps you to take care of this vanishing gradient problem, to make small adjustments or to estimate weights of 0 if you don't need to kind of adjust. And so it's just gonna end up working much better and let you have these very deep networks. And so this is an example of ResNet. I think this is just ResNet 34. If you like ResNet 101, which is commonly used, obviously it wouldn't fit in the slide. And so it's very, very simple. Every residual block has 2 layers of 3x3 filters, and periodically they double the number of filters and downsize spatially using the stride of 2. No fully connected layer at the end, just global average pooling, like we saw before. And then the other thing I should say is it also does incorporate these bottleneck layers, which we saw from GoogleNet. So it takes both kind of the insights from GoogleNet of having these bottleneck layers and getting rid of the fully connected layers to reduce the number of parameters. And then I'll just make a very quick note about ResNext. So if you compare ResNet to Inception or GoogleNet, there's 3 central properties that GoogleNet had that we saw. So there's the bottleneck, and we reduce the dimensions before the conv layers to take care of that so that the memory requirements don't blow up. There's shortcuts to go deep. So the auxiliary training layers, ResNet kind of solves that problem by using the residual. And then the other thing that ResNet had was these multiple branches where you were extracting features of various sizes by using multiple filters in parallel. And that third thing is what ResNet does not have, which led to another paper by the same authors called ResNext, which we don't have a huge amount of time to talk about, but it's just the essential intuition is that instead of like applying, 256 filters, or sorry, like 64 filters that are dimension 1 by 1, you might apply, them side by side and then add together. If you want, you can go to the reading list and read a bit more about this, but essentially the intuition is just that this is helping us to get kind of more width in the network in a way that can be computationally feasible, which kind of makes it a little bit more like the GoogleNet Inception module. And so this is what ResNext has. I mean, in practice, we've kind of used both ResNet and ResNext, and ResNext, obviously it takes longer to run, and like for us it didn't really like lead to huge improvements. And if you look at the ImageNet kind of challenge, I mean, ResNet was already nearly human level accuracy, and so this is something to be aware of. Like you can choose like as a a CNN backbone, ResNet or ResNext, and ResNext is kind of a little bit of a more complicated model. It may give you some benefits. It may not be worth the extra computational cost to you because ResNet is already pretty good. But we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to applications. And so again, this figure probably makes more sense now that we've been through all of this, and so essentially you see the deeper networks do better. VGG does pretty good, but it has those huge memory requirements because of those fully connected layers that essentially GoogleNet takes care of. These Inception ones here are just kind of a combination of GoogleNet and ResNet that's sort of similar to ResNext. And so you see that kind of ResNet has kind of a very high accuracy, but like pretty reasonable memory and is the state of the art. So I know we went through the last part and especially ResNext pretty quickly, but are there any questions at all? Okay, and so next class we'll talk specifically about image classification. And I think all of this, like, is not something that you kind of necessarily, have to understand every detail of, but I think it's just kind of useful to understand what these networks are doing under the hood and for it not just to be a total black box. And so, yeah, if you think of any questions or questions come up after you kind of look more in depth at some of the readings or whatever, don't hesitate to ask me or contact Jake, and we're happy to talk more. Thank you, guys.